Akeela with us. Yeah, okay, great. So thank you very much for joining us on our second workshop on Palestine and Israel, the impact on UK interfaith relations. Just to kind of say that obviously when we're working at FODIP, our focus is on communities in the UK, and one of our main charitable objectives is to improve UK community relations, especially in relation to Israel and Palestine situation, promoting and facilitating positive, sensitive dialogue between faith communities, especially when it comes to Muslims and Jews and Christians in dialogue on Israel and Palestine. So today's session will focus on addressing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in our communities in relation to Israel and Palestine, and where we think as FODIP and others, Solutions Not Sides and lots of other organisations have a big role to play in addressing and tackling anti-Semitism and hatred against Muslim communities. So we are very lucky to have Danny Stone and Akeela with us today. And we know sometimes events can heighten hate rhetoric, especially in those communities. So we do find that it's really, really important that we have the space and the education and appropriate space to have that dialogue. So I hope that today is a good start and we can continue this dialogue. So I'm going to start with introducing Danny Stone, if that's okay. So actually before that, so just give you a bit of a format of the session. So we'll have Danny speak, and then we'll have Akeela speak, and then we can have the rest of the time for questions. And we hope to finish by 3:30. If not, it will go on for 5–10 minutes extra, but not much more than that because Danny has to leave as well. He's got another appointment somewhere else. So handing over to Danny. Danny is the Chief Executive at Antisemitism Policy Trust. He's led the team there for over a decade now and has helped deliver a number of cross-party initiatives recognised by the government and civil society organisations as crucial to fight against anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. And you were awarded an MBE in 2017, so brilliant, congratulations for that, for services to combating hate crime. So over to you, Danny, and I will mute myself.
Super. Well, thank you, Sadia. Thank you, Rabbi Elf, and thank you for what you do. It's hugely important. And thank you for letting me share a panel with Akeela, who I am very fond of and have a tremendous amount of respect for, and would always readily jump at the chance to share a panel with her. I will talk about anti-Semitism in the context of the Middle East, and I'm going to say some things that I've spoken about on a previous FODIP panel, so apologies for those that have heard it before. I will speak about the Middle East, but I want to zoom out first, and this is it's not going to be the most joyous of things to talk about, but the truth is we live in a populist age, so there are attacks on our democratic principles, on our democracy. There are movements looking to blame somebody. It's all about what the enemy of the people is. It's the elite. It is, you know, those that are above us. It's people that can be blamed for all the troubles, the media, immigrants, if the people think that's what the issue is, Muslims, Zionists, whatever it is, there is a bogeyman that is out there to get people, and it kind of casts that this populism casts communities the good versus those that don't fit, right? So we are the great people, and it's these elites that are out to get us. And it's not about bettering lives. It's about ripping everything up and restarting. And we're seeing it across the world. We're seeing it in Germany, in France, in Hungary, in Brazil, in Russia. We've seen it in the UK. It's a politics of extremism, and it builds on conspiracy theories. And at the heart of many of the conspiracy theories is anti-Semitism. And those conspiracy theories are comforting because they help people feeling empowered. And in difficult times, like with COVID, you know, and I know we've seen this in terms of anti-Muslim hate, but certainly anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are rising up because it's troubling times and people want to feel comforted. And unfortunately, those that are involved in interfaith work and certainly in the debate about Israel-Palestine aren't immune to populism. It's something we have to guard against. Now, I want to just take a quick deep dive into how one of these things works. So look at populism as a tactic of the far right. So I always reflect on this talk that I heard by this US civil rights activist who argued that white supremacism had kind of died in the wake of the civil rights movement. And having failed, these supremacists had to answer the question of how they failed and why they failed. And being supremacist, that's quite a difficult pill to swallow. You don't really think you're bad at anything. And what did they come up with? It's a Jewish conspiracy. And so they persisted, adapted, and what was derived from this was this kind of this movement of white nationalism. And in practice, how does it work? Well, you know, look at the President of the United States telling elected American representatives to go back where they came from. But for nationalists, there's now different historical touch points. And so those who are going to college are going to be born after September 11th. The Holocaust is ancient history. And so the context in which they're fighting against what they would call progressive cultural hegemony is different. And that's a challenge to interfaith activists and those working with young people like FODIP does. Moving into other types of extremism that can interrupt and affect interfaith efforts to discuss the Middle East. There's war in the Middle East, conflict. It makes the work that we would want to do, I think, much harder. And when it comes to the Middle East and anti-Semitism, so the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust doesn't have a policy on Israel-Palestine, right? We don't get into the politics of it. We just look to educate around where anti-Semitism can emanate from the conflict or discussion of the conflict. So our organisation helps to provide the secretariat to the All-Party Parliamentary Group Against Anti-Semitism. And that group in 2015 ran an inquiry following the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza from the previous summer, from 2014. Now, as part of that inquiry, we worked with Lancaster University to look at Twitter during the use and its use that summer. So Lancaster had this tool they called DataSift, and they reviewed 22 million English tweets that were sent in the summer of 2014, including the words Jew and Muslim. And among the top 35 keywords for Jews was Nazi, Hitler, Holocaust, and so on. So that the language that was used with these words, it was hostile, it was accusatory, and it's a reminder that these external events can be used and are used sometimes deliberately to drive hateful, harmful rhetoric. We also worked with an academic who was then at Oxford and now been working at Birkbeck and other places to look at the banners and the flags that appeared at the protests that summer in 2014. And whilst it wasn't central to the protest, there were posters and placards that were accusing Jews of dual loyalty, being a third column, minimization and toleration of anti-Semitism. And the academics' view on all of this was that there was a kind of a conflict obsession, and it allowed the spread of just a casual anti-Semitism, and more ideological anti-Semitism was spread through this kind of obsessiveness, particularly online, and it allowed for what was occurring in far right places, as I was discussing before, to cross-pollinate to the left, back to the right. And so you had this wide spread of anti-Semitism and extremism, and then it manifests offline. And that certainly, when it comes to those looking to discuss Israel-Palestine in a reasoned way, to have kind of complex, serious talk, it makes it that much harder. Now, I mean, obviously, I suppose it's worth saying that the majority of British Jews, the polling indicates, have some connection to Israel. Majority of British Jews consider themselves Zionist, but that's obviously not to say that they have any particular affinity for an Israeli government of a particular time or its policies. And the official definition of anti-Semitism that exists says that blaming Jews collectively for the actions of the Israeli government is anti-Semitic. So it's worth just having that in the backdrop. I mean, I mention online harms. It's something I just also want to spend a minute talking about, because I think it's key in terms of anti-Semitism in and amongst the Israel-Palestine discussion. And online harms is a huge area to address, and something our organisation's been looking at. Specifically, for example, this kind of intersectional abuse happens online. Misogyny and anti-Semitism, they punch up against one another, and so Jewish women are on the receiving end of particular harms. And sometimes you see that in respect to the Middle East. Ruth Sneed, the former Member of Parliament, now the head of the Index on Censorship, gave plenty of examples in Parliament of where she was called various very offensive things in relation to the conflict, though she has no part in it. But obviously the anti-Semitism was brought in to the debate around Ruth, her activities as a politician. And so that ability for extremists to spread hate online is frightening at the moment. We work with a group called Media Matters, an American NGO, and they had explained to us that there was a group of online conspiracists who were seeking to change minds online, and they worked to try and mainstream flat earthism. And in approximately 1 year, 1 in 3 Americans under 25 were no longer convinced that the earth was round. So, you know, minds can be changed, and they can be changed fast. And it's these free speech message boards, you may or may not have heard of them, 4chan, 8chan, Gab. Now people that are being kicked off Twitter are going to an app called Parler. You can get these kind of what were once siloed communities, white supremacists, men's rights activists, conspiracists, and they all kind of converge. And it starts with a blog, it starts as you being a gamer, and maybe you're watching videos about veganism, and all of a sudden you're drawn down into a very extremist space, and they will use the convergence, these different spaces, to feed one another with their extremism. And so moderate discussion of Israel-Palestine in particular certainly is harder in those spaces. And in the meantime, I mean, I said this last time I was on the panel for you, that things in terms of our political leadership have not been great. So, certainly in the Labour Party, there's been issues with anti-Semitism. We've had the Prime Minister and his comments about veiled Muslim women, comparing them to letterboxes and bank robbers. And we know that inspires more hate. It feeds not just the attacks online and the memes and what have you, but it feeds action offline. And we know that Tell Mama, for example, the charity that monitors anti-Muslim hate figures, saw an increase in Islamophobia, in anti-Muslim attacks around the Prime Minister's comments, but also that there's been this increasing harm online. Both the Community Security Trust, which monitors anti-Semitic attacks, and Mama have seen this increase. And so when we're trying to debate Israel-Palestine, we know that this online impact is harming. We know that it then carries offline, and it makes conversations more difficult. And so we have to do something. And I suppose I'll kind of finish up my remarks on my view on what we can do. So I think there is a voice, and we need to ensure that as moderates, that we're not allowing ourselves to be squeezed, that we're pushing ourselves out and challenging extremist views, and or in fact conspiracy theories. And I suppose I should touch very briefly upon the fact that the past week or so there was Rebecca Long Bailey had tweeted an article by the actress Maxine Peake, and in it she had talked about this suggestion that Israel was responsible potentially for the techniques that were used, which ended up in the murder of George Floyd in America, the black man who was killed, and then which inspired protests in the Black Lives Matter movement, and has seen so much change since. Now that is a conspiracy theory. People will cite an Amnesty report from 2016 about Israel and American police exchanging and learning techniques, but byword for Jews is found at the heart in these conspiracy theories of everything evil. And in this case, it didn't need Israel to train racist American police officers to kill a black man. and I'm happy to talk about that more if needs be, but the challenging these stereotypes, being a voice of moderation, rebutting and mocking conspiracy theories is important. I think breaking down stereotypes is important, right? So people have particular strong views, and when I was at university and a friend of mine who had never met a Jew got to know me as a Jew, then I think that made a difference. It humanized me and it humanized the words, and so bringing people together is really important. I think we need to tackle intercommunal prejudice, because I don't think it helps in discussion of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred. I think there is prejudice in both communities, and I mean, there's prejudice in every community. I'm pleased, for example, the Board of Deputies at the moment is looking at inequalities in the Jewish community in terms of anti-Black racism, but I think it would be just as well that the Jewish community needs to look at anti-Muslim hate too. We need to tackle extremism online. Is absolutely key. The impact is huge, and the government's on the verge of bringing out a online harms white paper, an online harms bill, which will, we hope, introduce a regulator in this online space with a duty of care for the social media platforms. That's hugely important. And anything that we can do together as Muslims and Jews, or people in general who want to fight anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, anything that we can do together, whether it's in this space or not, is important, because it humanizes, it brings people together. So, when Akeela and I were talking about dealing with discrimination in the press, that's a good example. It's a shared project. We have shared values, and it's something we want to do together. So there's a very brief overview about my concerns, about where I see anti-Semitism coming in the Middle East conflict, about populism a bit more broadly. I'm happy to answer questions on that or other things. But I hope that's been useful or instructive in some way, and I'll end it there for the moment.
Thank you, Danny, and that's definitely been useful. I know for myself, and I'm sure for others as well, but we'll come to questions later on if that's okay. So we'll ask Akeela to start. So if I just introduce Akeela, she's the chair of the independent members of the cross-government working group on anti-Muslim hatred. She's also been an equalities and a campaigner and activist on equalities. She Speaks We Hear, which gives unfiltered women's voice a platform. So I'm sure, Akeela, you can tell us a bit more about that, and then I will hand it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sadia, and thanks for inviting me back again to take part in a FODIP event. I have so much respect for FODIP, and also really honoured to be sharing a panel with Danny again, and I have so much respect for all the work that you do, Danny, and constantly learning from everything that you do. So similar to Danny, some of what I say might sound familiar, or because I'm going to reiterate some of the things that I presented, some of the themes that I presented at the FODIP conference in September and the panel that I shared with Danny. So in September, I highlighted how the number of hate crimes being reported in the UK is rising, and how this had direct consequences for Muslim and Jewish communities, not only in the UK, but also globally. And then I sort of had a kind of stark sort of picture and warning that as hate crimes are rising, specifically anti-Muslim hatred and anti-Semitic hate crimes were sort of the majority of faith-based hate crimes, and more broadly anti-Muslim hatred and anti-Semitic sentiments were increasing, and we saw these manifest in different ways across society, so within public discourse, within politics. And I felt at that time it was not an understatement to state that even though we live in Britain and Britain is wonderful, there were instances where Jews and Muslims were suffering. And we see this on a global scale as well, in the sense that in 2018 and 2019, we saw attacks on the mosques in Christchurch, and we saw attacks on synagogues in the US and elsewhere. And these attacks really reminded us that Jewish and Muslim communities faced a joint threat from white supremacists. who believed that Muslims and Jewish communities were part of a white genocide conspiracy to replace majority white Christian Europeans. And Danny has spoken about how these conspiracies work and how they, contribute to how people think, how they can inculcate people into their thinking, and how they can result in offline violence, such as the terror attacks on mosques and synagogues I've just mentioned. But obviously now we're in July, and a lot has happened since September 2019. Since March, we have all been in a national time of crisis due to the global pandemic of COVID. And I just wanted to kind of touch on some of the trends in Islamophobia that we've seen on the working group since the start of the pandemic. So at the very start of the pandemic, some believed that this would mean hatred, generally sort of extremism, but probably specifically Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred would diminish as people's minds were focused elsewhere. They were worried about potentially the pandemic. I knew at that time, as an expert on anti-Muslim hate and bigotry, that probably we would see the opposite. And unfortunately, I don't like to be proven right, and especially not in this kind of case. And that's exactly what happened. I knew at that time that it would not be long before Muslims were also blamed for the spread of COVID-19. I remember somebody saying to me, how can you say that? It's got nothing to do with Muslims. People are directing their anger towards China and people of sort of East Asian descent. And I said, well, I've seen how there can be a seemingly non-sort of Muslim issue, how Muslims are then brought into the conversation and blamed for it. And so in my role as chair of the independent members of the cross-government anti-Muslim hatred working group, I commissioned a briefing report into Islamophobia in the context of COVID-19. So this briefing report was co-authored by Professor Imran Awan, who's another independent member, and Roxana Khan-Williams, who works to provide support to the independent members. And the report, titled Coronavirus, Fear and How Islamophobia Spreads on Social Media, found that COVID-19 sparked online Islamophobia in the form of racist memes and fake news. And these memes and this fake news was being shared widely across all social media platforms. So, the mainstream social media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook. And unfortunately, some of that rhetoric went viral. There were fake videos and pictures falsely showing British Muslims attending mosques and flouting social distancing rules. So this is at the beginning of the lockdown. And these were debunked, but they had already been shared thousands of times in some instances. The police and others had sort of tweeted and said, these things aren't true, but unfortunately the damage had already been done. There was already this idea that because of the beliefs and practices and the culture of British Muslims, that they were somehow inherently spreading COVID-19 more than any other person or any other group in the UK. And I know that the CST produced similar briefings around the blaming of Jewish communities and attributing COVID-19 to Jewish communities, and they had found similar conspiracies. So these trends were deeply concerning, and they have direct consequences offline on hate crime, community cohesion and well-being. And what we found was that some of these conspiracies and fake news that was being perpetuated about British Muslims were then infiltrating sort of public discourse in the media. So we saw some scare stories just ahead of Ramadan about how potentially there would be a spike in cases simply because people were fasting during Ramadan. And then we saw similar sort of scare stories around Eid time. And these were put out in sort of, your regular news outlet, the Metro, the Independent, for example. And so not, the Sun or, other, the Express or whatever. And these kind of ideas are quite subtle, and people wouldn't necessarily think of them as being, conspiratorial or anti-Muslim. But they express anti-Muslim sentiments, basically. So going back to our report indicated that COVID-19 could become a trigger event similar to the way terrorist events become trigger events for a spike in hate crime against British Muslims. And obviously, when there was lockdown, people were not going out and about, but the report did warn that as lockdown restrictions are eased, we might see a spike in hate crime, and we might see a spike in hate crime specifically against British Muslims and indeed British Jews as well. And unfortunately, that is still a risk. We're seeing now from the 4th of July, you know, social distancing, lockdown specific measures are going to be lifted, and we are concerned that this might then allow more opportunity for people to carry out hate crimes targeted against British Muslims. And especially as during this time, Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred has been allowed to incubate on social media platforms, but then, you know, certain actions have been taken. For example, Katie Hopkins has been suspended from Twitter, which is really, really good, good news, and hopefully that will diminish some of that incubation, at least on the mainstream platforms like Twitter. But, you know, these ideas have been sort of percolating for the last few weeks during this pandemic, and so that risk is still there that the coronavirus could become a trigger event. So at the last panel in September, I also highlighted how anti-Jewish and Islamophobic discourses not only exist in wider communities, but they also exist, unfortunately, within our own two faith groups. And that is an issue that we do have to deal with, and it is obviously a problem. Any bigotry or hatred that exists about the other within our communities is obviously going to be compounded by the conflict in Israel and Palestine, and the wider political tension in the Middle East and the region. And this obviously then has an impact on our interfaith work. You know, interfaith organizations like FODIP, like Nisa Nasheem, that I'm a trustee of, the Muslim and Jewish Women's Network, we work, you know, along with all the other interfaith groups, we work hard all year round to build trust and strengthen the bonds between our two faith groups. But unfortunately, this interfaith work can be undermined by global trigger events. So what do I mean by global trigger events? So the proposed annexation of the West Bank by the government led by the Prime Minister Netanyahu is an example of a trigger event that could then cause tensions and divisions between our respective communities. Local political events also potentially impact relations between British and Jewish communities in the UK, and essentially undermine our ability to live in a cohesive and hate-free society. So examples of this, I would say, are the tweet from the Black Lives Matter UK Twitter account, and the sacking of Rebecca Long-Bailey from the Shadow Cabinet. These political moments can act as triggers and for causing sort of mistrust and tension. And I'll spend a few minutes just talking about what I mean by that. So from working with communities, and I'm talking now specifically about British Muslims communities, I know that British Muslims want to work more closely with British Jewish communities, and they do not see themselves as anti-Semitic. But however, more often than not, they have not had the opportunity to meet or work with Jewish people in a meaningful way. And so there is this sort of lack of understanding of the other, there is this mistrust as well. And then any events in Palestine and Israel, especially, you know, around conflict, can feed into any mistrust and any misconceptions that British Muslims might have of Jewish communities. And sometimes this can feed into a narrative of a good Jew versus a bad Jew. It can also feed into, obviously, anti-Semitism. And there is also a lack of education of terms like Zionism and what does it mean to be a Zionist. I think many people in the British Muslim communities would not understand what those terms mean. They might think it means discrimination of Palestinians, and they won't understand that there is a diversity of Zionism. and a diversity of people who call them Zionists. And I think there needs to be some education about this. And there also needs to be education on other issues as well. You know, I myself am still learning, and I include myself when I say that many Muslims are not educated about the history of Palestine and Israel. Neither do they understand the realities on the ground, what it's like, and, you know, for people living in Israel, what the differences are between Israel and Palestine. They won't understand perhaps the demographics. Often they're only given one view about what it means to be Palestinian and the lives of Palestinians, often from charity fundraisers. And that often promotes a single narrative of Palestinian suffering only. And it also frames the conflict in Israel and Palestine as a Muslim issue when it's not just a Muslim issue. So in my experience within Muslim communities, there is a lack of knowledge and understanding of the situation. And then there's in Israel and Palestine and the conflict. But then there's also a lack of understanding and knowledge of anti-Semitism and how it manifests across society, and in particular on the far left, and how it can manifest in subtle ways. So people might not necessarily understand why Rebecca Long Bailey was sacked, why she was accused of engaging in anti-Semitism. They won't understand what Danny described as a conspiracy theory. They won't understand that, and they would need some help and understanding and education in being taken on a journey to get to that understanding. So traditional anti-Semitic tropes can often be put forward within communities without them realizing that it is anti-Semitism. And I'm sure this also takes place across wider society as well. In fact, I know it does, but I am at the moment thinking about the communities that I come from and Muslim communities. And another example of where people can stray into anti-Semitism is, I think, when talking about and discussing Israel and the policies and the actions of the current Israeli government, people, I think, can struggle or they do not know how to do that without straying into anti-Semitism. And there's also a lack of understanding of how to talk about these issues, how to provide a perspective that is critical of policies, for example, the proposed annexation of the West Bank, in a way that is constructive and does not stray into anti-Semitism. So a consequence of all of this is that interfaith spaces, in interfaith spaces, the Israel-Palestine conflict can become the elephant in the room, and it can impact on the very important interfaith work that many of us are engaging in, because people feel silenced and they feel they do not know how to talk about these difficult issues. And often they feel like because they don't know how to talk about these issues, then they will keep quiet. But then it can manifest its way in tension. It can manifest itself in tensions in other ways. And there's, you know, people tell me they fear as well offending, and because they do not know or understand anti-Semitism, they fear that they will be accused of anti-Semitism as well. So these are very sensitive issues, and they're very difficult to navigate, and they're not easy to navigate. And I include myself when I say that. So how can we address you know, these challenges? How can we address sort of bigotry and misconceptions and hatred within our own communities? And I mentioned this before, but I'm a firm believer that a good place to start is to get to know the other and not to shy away from having these difficult conversations. That doesn't mean that we should only ever talk about the Middle East conflict, no, but it does mean that we need to have safe spaces like the safe spaces that FODIP creates, and have some of these difficult conversations, but in a guided way, and to be given the tools to be able to have those conversations, and then to be able to have those conversations and realize that we're not going to agree on everything necessarily. And that just doesn't mean, you know, Muslims and Jews. It can mean Muslims and Muslims and Jews and whatever, and Christians and whatever, basically. We're not going to necessarily agree, but we're going to come out of those conversations as friends and as people who can still stand together against hatred, and they can still stand together in solidarity, and they can still continue to work together and do good. And so I think it's really important that we understand that we're not going to agree on some things, and that we are not going to be able to solve the Israel-Palestine conflict. And one way to sort of recognize that is to focus on our communities and the context of our communities here in the UK, and to continue to nurture and develop the ties between our communities, and recognizing that there are lots of commonalities and there are lots of common issues that we can work on together. So, for example, British Muslims and British Jews came together at the start of the COVID crisis to ensure that burials could take place as they would normally within our respective communities, and that people would not be cremated. And that's just one example. There are many, many more examples. I think it's also critical that we not only stand by each other, you know, against Islamophobia and against anti-Semitism, but we also don't take part in the denial of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia when it takes place in society or in our own communities. So I think I will stop there, but I am happy to take any questions, and I hope my insights were useful.
Thank you, Akeela. They definitely were. I think both you and Danny, you know, picked up on very important points there. And I guess one of the things that I also find is that as much as we learn is still not enough. I'm still learning, and every time we come back from the region, for example, we are much more confused than when we went in the first place. So what that means is actually it's a learning process for all of us, but we have to make sure that we've got space to be able to discuss these things. We educate our young people and our communities properly, but we have to be able to feel brave enough to do that. And sometimes we might find it offensive, or we might offend someone, but how do we make sure that we can talk about that in a very sensitive way, and we're able to, like you said, Akeela, come out of that room still staying together and being friends. So I'm kind of going to go on to some of the questions that I've also already received. It would be great if people had any more questions for Danny or Akeela, and they can just use the chat facility to ask those. But I'm going to kind of dive in there first of all for a question with a question for Danny. The proposed annexation of the West Bank will inevitably lead to critical responses from both national churches and local churches. This has caused hurt to the Jewish community, and locally protest meetings in church premises hired by groups such as the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign and groups supporting BDS. What is the most helpful way in which members of the Jewish and Christian community can respond? Next question.
Okay. I don't think it's just the churches that will be critical, by the way. I think there'll be quite a lot of other people. There was an article the other day about 100 Jewish, I want to say judges perhaps, or lawmakers who'd signed a letter. So I mean, there's going to be, I think, a vast number of people who are critical. I think the thing for me is that it's proper and right that there is discussion of this, and that there be a space for people to voice their anger and their criticism and their concerns, and I mean ideally to have constructive discussion, but actually just to be allowed to be angry about it. I think what in terms of helping to ensure that this happens in the best way, there's something we could learn from what we've done with universities, which is there was a problem of hate speakers coming onto campus on universities, and the Union of Jewish Students came to Parliament. We tried to work something out. Basically, I think I'm a big proponent of free speech. And I think, so look, you can have free speech so long as you've got the right protections in place, right? So if there are going to be things happening in churches, panels with whichever group, make sure that you just check out which group it is beforehand. You know, have there been any concerns raised about the group or the speaker in the past? And might you want to just discuss those in advance just to protect yourself? Might you want to film the event just in case something goes horribly wrong? You want to ensure that you've got a video of the event. Do you need extra security to the event? Is there anybody in the local community who you might want to warn about the fact that it's happening, just so that they're prepared for something, or they know that something might be said? You know, it's about just having the right kind of procedures in place. Now, I'm not saying you need to go overboard, right? I think plenty of people can have events without there being any issues, but just make sure that you kind of, you've had the discussion. You don't want to get caught out. So there was an event in Parliament not that long ago where 2 SNP MPs had invited a group in called Europal. There was some concerns raised about a booklet that had been handed out by Europal, not written by them, but handed out by them, which included a theory about Jews, which suggests that Jews are from the Khazar region. And I won't go into it now, but it's kind of a disproven theory about whether Jews have any kind of basis to claim that they've got any connection to the land of Israel. So there was an issue, and it flared up because no one had really done the research that they should have done in advance of the event. So just a little bit of research and a little bit of careful thinking can probably prevent quite a lot of problems. So I'd just say, just be a bit sensitive to the planning of an event. That's it.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you, Danny. Another question from Phyllis about the Black Lives Matter tweet. And I know you did respond to that, Danny, because I did see that on Twitter. And what Phyllis was asking was, what was your opinion in light of that tweet that Zionism was gagging Britain?
So I said on Twitter, it was a very disappointing tweet, because the movement, the BLM movement, is so important. And it's got so many important things that are being campaigned for, that are being highlighted, awareness raising, practical changes. The tweet just was so disappointing. Now the tweet was critical of Israel, basically, except that, as you say, it had this one line in it about Zionism, people being gagged in British politics from criticizing Zionism. Now that, so far as I'm concerned, is an anti-Semitic trope, because anybody can go out there, a politician can get up in Parliament and criticize Zionism, full stop, they can do. And anybody can get up in Speaker's Corner and do it, and anyone can write in the press and do it. It's just untrue to say it's being gagged. And the suggestion of gagging implies some kind of hidden power. It implies that the Jews were basically out, and I think the context, I don't know, I think the context was the Rebecca Long-Bay sacking. The suggestion was that she had been sacked perhaps for speaking against Zionism. Well, that isn't what had happened, for what it's worth. But to suggest there's a gagging in British politics, suggests there's some kind of power or influence, harks back to all of these conspiracy theories about Jews being not just lowly and verminous and what have you, but being all powerful, being the Christ killers, being the people who are behind pornography to upset the morals in society, the people who are behind the banks and what have you. It's the same theme again. And so it was ever so disappointing. Now, I mean, there's been, since that tweet, there's been a vast discussion of how inappropriate it was, and certainly in and amongst the football circles, because there's the football community has adopted the Black Lives Matter movement in its heart, and people have been getting on one knee. There's been a lot of discussion about whether it was appropriate or not for that tweet to go out, and they tend to be falling on the side that it wasn't. And there are concerns about the individual behind the account, perhaps, and the GoFundMe account that's been set up. So I think it's a more complex thing than this one line. But the one line in itself, in my view, is an anti-Semitic trope, and it was deeply damaging. And I just hope that one tweet now will not lead to a damage of the movement, and hopefully this individual will reflect on what they said and learn something about it.
Thank you. I agree. I know a number of our young people who are involved with FODIP also contacted me about that tweet as well. So yeah, it was something very concerning for lots of people. Just another question for you, Danny. I feel like they're all coming towards you. Danny, as you pointed out, anti-Muslim hatred is very widespread, particularly since the 9/11 days. Do you have any idea of the breadth and depth of the spread of anti-Muslim hatred within British Jewish communities? How does it show up? Has this been something that has been investigated or identified? Thank you.
it's a good question, because the truth is I've not seen any kind of polling that I can think of on it. I need to double check, but I don't think I've seen any polling on it, so I can't speak to how widespread it is. I just know anecdotally of 2 or 3 examples of people making just passing Islamophobic comment. I know of one in school, even at an interfaith event, for example, which was actually challenged by a Jewish teacher then and there. But you know, it gives you a sense that if it can happen in that setting, that it must be happening in others. And so, no, I don't know the extent of it, but I would expect that there is a just it's past that dinner table test, as Baroness Barsi said, right? It's just that there may be some anti-Muslim chatter in Jewish households. But that's a challenge, I guess, is to go away and do some work on it, because as I said, I think there should be some work looking at that, looking at the prejudice that's held in the community, and because until you know the extent of it, you can't properly address it. So we do need to better understand it, and I wish I could be more helpful.
Thank you, appreciate that. So this is a question for both of you, and I think it's something that I would also kind of benefit from as well. I mean, we look at how social media has such a big part to play in the narratives that are so easily accessible now. So we've got a question here. It says, could we hear a little more of proposed legislation to tackle inflammatory and hateful speech in social media, please? And that's a question from David. And then there's another part to it, which I'll send that afterwards. So if we answer this question first. So Akeela, do you want to go with that one first?
I was actually going to suggest that Danny covers that bit, because you're more of an expert than I am on the online harms paper and the proposals in it, and I haven't looked at that for a while. So
yeah, I'm happy to. I just feel bad that I've spoken so much.
No, please go ahead.
I'll give you a very brief overview. Basically, up until now, the government's had a few voluntary codes of practice for social media providers, right? So there's things that they kind of are supposed to have been doing if they wanted to, with no real comeuppance for failing to do so. As present, there was what's called a white paper, which is a prelude and a kind of a first rough draft of legislation. And this white paper suggested some things that might happen, and that leads us to believe there are certain things going to be brought into law, and we're expecting this bill any day now. So there will be an online harms bill. We expect what it will do is bring in a regulator for the social media environment, and generally for I mean, platforms where there's kind of discussion going on. So it'll be quite a wide remit that it has. There are obviously regulators in all kinds of industries, but it looks like the one that's going to be proposed for regulation of social media space is Ofcom, which already regulates what we watch on television. The thing that goes alongside this regulator being brought in is what's called a duty of care. Now that is similar to kind of health and safety executives in football stadiums, whereby there's perhaps someone responsible for checking what's going on and warning systems in place. Social media platforms will have a kind of a system whereby they are warned about something, perhaps they're warned again, and if they fail to address the harm, then they will have some form of punitive action taken against them. They will have a fine perhaps, or it may even be, as is the case in Germany now, that someone's put in prison if they fail to address a particular harm. Now there's other things this regulator will do, like issue codes of practice, and it will force the social media companies to produce transparency reports. It may fine them, that's still up for discussion. And the codes of practice it releases are quite important. So for example, we looked at Twitter and the GIFs, moving images on Twitter. Those services aren't provided by Twitter, they're provided by another party that Twitter contracts in. But that third party didn't have the same standards as Twitter, so we were able to find anti-Semitic GIFs on Twitter. So we would hope that a code of practice would help straighten those things out. And then there's some other bits that are open to discussion. So for example, at the moment, if I were to publish something on Facebook, Facebook is not liable for that content. They've got a special exemption. and there's a question over whether what are called internet service providers should be content service providers, and this relates to European directives and European law, and the way in which we've translated that European law and transposed it. Could we make the social media platforms liable for the content that's posted on them? And that's a very big discussion that's still going to happen. So that's a very, very quick overview of some of the issues and some of the things that are going to happen. There's much, much more. Our website, I should say, which is due an upgrade any day, at the moment, at least on our resources page, you can find a briefing about the white paper and the online harms bill, which will take you through in more detail what's going on with that. That's antisemitism.org.uk.
Thank you, Danny. Can I ask another question from Bernard, which is there opportunity for Jewish and Muslim groups to collaborate to prepare educational materials to be used in schools?
Shall I take that one?
Oh.
So I think there are already some organisations that are doing this work. I think the Anne Frank Trust goes into schools. There's also 3FF, is it still called 3FF? I might be getting its name wrong. Three Face Forum, basically. I've forgotten what the current iteration is. I apologise if anybody from Three Face Forum is on the seminar at the moment. They also do a lot of work going into schools as well, and addressing some of these issues. Nisa Nashim, we've done some work with young people. I know obviously FODIP, you do a lot as well. So I think that there is already some work going on, but there's also always opportunity to do more. I think we can't do enough. What I find from talking to my own children is that there seems for some reason to be a lack of understanding of the history of the Holocaust, and there's a lack of understanding of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism within schools. And what we found on the working group is that casual, everyday Islamophobia is very prevalent amongst some young people in schools, and it's not being picked up on by teachers. So people can make throwaway comments. So one anecdotal example is that a fire alarm went off in a school in Slough. And so when the fire alarm goes, I mean, obviously this was pre-COVID, but when the fire alarm goes off, then the school children have to file outside and, you know, go into their sort of form lines and things. And when they were doing that, there were some young people who were sort of making jokes, oh, it's the Muslims again. Meaning that, you know, Muslims had caused either a terrorist event or something, for some reason for the fire alarm to go off. And that was a throwaway comment made in front of the teachers, and the teachers didn't call it out, the other students didn't call it out, and the Muslim students who were there just kind of laughed it off. But this kind of what is called banter kind of happens a lot, happens in sports, happens in the playground. So there is a lot more, I think there's more that can be done. And actually, you don't have to wait for organizations to do this stuff. As a parent, you can go to your school and say, hey, you know, have you ever done a session about, you know, about Islamophobia, you know, bullying, about anti-Semitism, you know, and you could, if you know, I'm Muslim, I know Jewish women, you know, I could say, for example, you know, I'm happy to come in and do a session with another Jewish parent, whatever. And also there's one organization which I forgot to mention, which is Stand Up Education, which does a lot of work. I've sat in one of their workshops. They do a lot of work in schools around the country on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and their workshops are very good, and I actually recommend adults to do them as well, not just for young people.
Thanks, Akeela. Can I just add to that? Those solutions outside also go into schools as well and deliver presentations. And I do think there needs to be, I think a point that you made there, it's not only with the young people or the students, it's also finding the confidence to be able to kind of, for the teachers to be able to address those things, because that's what we find is a lot of the teachers feel uncomfortable or are afraid of doing that. So that's also another challenge, I guess, that we need to tackle. Yasmin has just let us know that the 3FS now is Faith and Beliefs Forum. You can also access the school linking network, and both produce education and teacher training resources and work with Muslim Jewish schools specifically and mainstream schools. Another question, and then we'll kind of end it. And we've also got Sana who wants to ask a question at the end. So when we unmute everybody, Sana can ask that question. But before we do that, I'll just ask this question from Laura, if I can get to it. Excuse me, sorry. Okay, here we go. So comments from Akeela on how us in Leicester, locally in Leicester lockdown, can tackle conspiracy theories that Muslims or the wider BAME communities are to blame for COVID and the local lockdown in particular, please. Because obviously we know that Leicester is in lockdown at the moment.
Yeah, I really feel for the people in Leicester. I've got family in Leicester and I know they're really disappointed with having a local lockdown. What I would say is it's really important to give people the facts, but also to kind of get to know people a bit, you know, whoever's coming up with this kind of conspiracy theory, if you can, if it's appropriate, and to really understand where it's coming from. Because I think when you can understand what's going on underneath, you know, what are the fears that somebody's kind of experiencing that's making them express this, or maybe they've read something or they've been speaking to somebody, then you can kind of try and unpick a bit where the conspiracy theory is coming from and then try and address that as well. I know in Leicester there's different issues going on and there's some sort of local tensions as well because of sort of global politics which then start playing out at kind of local level, and there's kind of different actors there who kind of try to exacerbate some of these existing tensions. But that would be my kind of advice.
Unmute, Sadia.
Sorry, I always forget to unmute myself. So I guess that's also a concern from one of our facilitators from FODIP, Sumaya, who also said something similar about actually she feels that there's an increase in Islamophobia in Leicester due to this. And obviously a lot of, or some of that is online, and social media has a big part to play. So I hope we're able to tackle some of that, I guess.
There was a lot of anti-Muslim conspiracy theories originating from India that were being shared online right at the very start of the pandemic, and we were seeing a lot of that then cause violence against Muslims in India. And obviously it's very, very complex. I'm just giving a quick summary, but that then had consequences here in the UK and elsewhere as well, unfortunately.
Thank you. I'm going to kind of ask Warren to conclude.
Well, I'll unmute Sana, and Sana can ask her question first.
Please.
That's all right.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you, Sadia. So my question, I have a question for both Danny Stone and Akeela Ahmed. For Danny, what you said about the case of Rebecca Bailey, and I've been following on that and discussing with close Jewish friends. My worry or concern about such cases is, don't you think that anti-Semitism have been defined by now in many cases as an ad hoc thing, and so loose and so widely that what it has created, and I'm talking as a Palestinian and as a Muslim, in the Palestinian Muslim side, it's kind, there's fear that anytime you can say anything, the Jewish community, somebody says that's anti-Semitic, and then you're labeled, and then you need to deal with that. And my problem with that case, because I did study at the Hebrew University, and I've read reports about the Secret Service in Israel, about its tactics. It could be like putting the knee on the neck. It could be a tactic, and it could be that there's cooperation between Israel and the US. Of course, that doesn't mean that you are saying every Israeli is involved and every Jewish person is involved. But my fear is how much also you think anti-Semitism has been used to hush criticism about Israel. And I would like to say that you wouldn't want this to bring the Palestinian and Muslim community just to be afraid to speak to the Jewish community. And to Akeela, equivalent to that, there was an article by Melanie Phillips last year that accused anyone who approves Islamophobia of anti-Semitism automatically. And I was really outraged by that. And I thought to myself, do we need to go as far as to also criminalize kind of anyone who denies Islamophobia or makes automatic accusation of anti-Semitism to Muslims? So we would also, is that a good way, or are we going to stand out as also being too powerful that we can sack people, and then it's counterproductive? It actually feeds the argument that here you can sack anyone who says anything that you don't agree with. So it's a cycle.
Thank you, Sana. Who wants to take that first?
I mean, look, you're right to an extent that there are those out there who would use anti-Semitism to try and hush people up, right? I think there are. I don't think that they are. I am absolutely certain that is not mainstream Jewish communal organizations, right? And I know that to be the case, certainly for the CST, the Community Security Trust, and ourselves, the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust, and the MPs I work with on the All-Party Group Against Anti-Semitism. So I think if you look for mainstream, respectable voices and learned voices on anti-Semitism, including academics, David Hirsch, David Feldman, people like that, that is not what you get. I think there are some shrill voices out there that misunderstand anti-Semitism and will try and, for example, misapply the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism for their own ends. But as I say, I don't think you will get that from mainstream or informed people like me. Now, when it comes to the Long Bailey piece, I think one has to take every example on its context, right? So the context here is that this was a racist murder in America of a black man. There's a long history of this, right? When you look into the facts of it, there are American-Israeli police exchanges. I don't think anyone should deny that. That's true. And if people want to campaign against that, then go for it, you know. I think that when it talked about the exchanges that they do, the program, if you look at the guy who initiated, says it was because there were fears after September 11th that there was American a lack of preparedness in America for dealing with potential terrorist situations. They wanted to draw on Israeli expertise, right? So that's why it was set up. It wasn't set up for any other reason. When it comes to the Israeli police, it isn't a policy of the Israeli police, at least if we take what they're saying on good faith, and some may not. But if we take what they're saying on good faith, it's not the policy to do this neck kneeling that's been happening. And it's not something that they do, and they may do it in terrorist training, but certainly these cops didn't think that George Floyd was a terrorist. So kind of, you know, if you look at the different elements of it and you deconstruct it, there isn't, I don't think, a basis in fact to suggest this was because the training they received in Israel. And there's no suggestion that these cops in, there was Minnesota, went out and got that training and were even trained in this way. And the fact that therefore Israel's drawn in, to my mind, makes it part of that centrality of Israel to everything that's evil in the world, in the same way that it's brought into COVID or that it's brought into any other particular political issue at a given time. So I think the facts show that it's questionable at best that this was in fact what happened, and actually when you see enough of this stuff, Israel as the root of all evil and Israel as the go-to, it does feed those anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. But I think that each case has to be taken on its merits. And I'm giving an extended answer because I think it's important, but I've been approached 2 or 3 times now to give like expert opinions on cases of anti-Semitism, be it in a school or an employment situation, because actually it is important that we get this stuff right. And it is important that people are not called anti-Semites when they aren't. And my view has always been, and I'll finish up with this, there's a good example, right? There's an MP called Neil Hamvey who tweeted when there was violence on the border between Israel and Gaza, Hamas and in Gaza, he tweeted, you know, have these people not learned anything? And he shared a Soros picture of Soros as a puppet master. He's not an anti-Semite, right? He tweeted a couple of anti-Semitic things, and there will have been people jumping and saying anti-Semite. But my approach was, he's done this stuff, let's talk, let's meet, let's speak, and we work together. And he's written an article in the Jewish News about you know, why he's not an anti-Semite, why he now understands what he wrote. And that to me is a real success. I don't think that everyone is an anti-Semite. And in fact, 2.4% probably of the UK, we would consider anti-Semites, but 30%, may hold one anti-Semitic opinion to be true. That doesn't mean they're anti-Semites. It means they're parroting an anti-Semitic opinion. So it's really important, as you say, that we don't jump on everyone and say anti-Semite. It's important that we help explain what anti-Semitism is. And that's what I'm trying to do. So sorry, it's an extremely long answer, but it was a very, very good question.
So I'll answer the other part of the question. So just to kind of clarify, so basically, are you talking about the article in which Melanie Phillips basically claimed that Islamophobia is a bogus term and is actually just there to provide cover for anti-Semitism? Is that the article you're talking about? So, I mean, you know, I generally don't agree with a lot of what Melanie Phillips says. That's just, you know, I think most of us are like that. Well, I hope so anyway, but that's another issue. But I think, you know, as Danny said, you know, I think there will be people who will use Islamophobia, you know, when there's no basis for it. They will use it to cover something else, perhaps, as you know, Melanie says. But you know, I think her article was it was wrong and deeply problematic on so many ways. And to just, you know, state that Islamophobia has been concocted just to provide cover to certain countries in this world is in itself an anti-Muslim trope, basically. And she knew that by writing that she would be told that, but she does it because she has her own perspectives and her own agenda, basically. And then obviously she knew that she would elicit that reaction, and then she would say, yes, so you've proved my point, basically, as well. So it's really kind of convoluted, but and also it's so deeply problematic and really pernicious, you know, in the way that she wrote that piece. But coming to the point about, you know, should people be sacked for Islamophobia? I think, you know, again, you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. Some people who engage in anti-Muslim tropes and conspiracy theories, especially on the kind of more sort of subtle kind of mainstream stuff, they probably don't know they're engaging in that. You know, I mentioned in my presentation, you know, outlets like The Independent and the Metro, you know, having these kind of scaremongering articles about a spike in COVID just because of Ramadan and Eid. I'm pretty sure those journalists didn't know that their headlines, or the editors didn't know that their headlines were feeding into these wider conspiracy theories and fake news about Muslims and COVID, and that these were anti-Muslim sentiments. Should they be sacked? No, I think they should be educated. There is obviously going to be a spectrum of when people engage in anti-Muslim prejudice and when they engage in anti-Muslim hate speech and when they enact, you know, anti-Muslim hate crimes. If somebody engages in something which is hate speech and is going to cause harm and is a crime, then yes, they absolutely should be sacked if they're in a position of responsibility. For example, yesterday I found out that there is a teacher in a school who regularly writes articles for Breitbart, which for people who do not know is a far-right extreme outlet. You know, should they be in a position of being a teacher in a school where they teach young people, impressionable young people? Actually, I don't think so. But, you know, I'm not directly involved in that situation, and maybe, you know, there could be a recourse. You'd have to speak to that teacher, you know, school would have to speak to them, they'd have to deal with them, take them on a journey, whatever. If they still don't, you know, address their views, or they still insist they want to continue to write for Breitbart, then no, they should be sacked. They shouldn't be a teacher, you know. So I think you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. There is another example that comes to mind. There was a couple of years, I think last year or maybe the year before, it came out that the CEO of Women's Aid, a charity that deals with BAME women as well as other women, but specifically have a large contingent of Muslim women that they deal with and they're supposed to help and support. It turned out that the CEO had been very supportive of UKIP and had praised UKIP in her previous role as a CEO of another organization. And some of the things, you know, and in that in itself, you know, one could argue that actually, you know, she'd done a previous role, now she's doing another one, it's fine. And yes, but then it then transpired that she had written and she'd spoken you know, in very supportive ways of UKIP, in support of UKIP, and had praised them, and she wasn't going to kind of withdraw herself from those comments and ideas. She stood by them. She was given a choice, you know, either you can stand by those comments and things, or you can, you know, step away from your role, and she chose to step away from her role. So we have to kind of take it on a case-by-case basis. I understand the fear, because there is this idea at the moment that there is a kind of, you know, political correctness is kind of, you know, squashing society, is kind of gagging people. There's an element of activists that are kind of dictating everything that happens in British politics. And that is just another trope. It's just not true at all, basically. And what you'll find often, people who kind of go on about identity politics actually, or criticize what they call identity politics, actually, you know, put forward their identity politics very well and benefit from it, more so than the kind of minority people that they're criticizing. I'm sorry if that's not clear. I think I kind of said it in a convoluted way, but I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Akeela. I think that did give a very full and clear answer. And very much I'd like to say a very big thank you to you and to Danny for helping us explore this topic this afternoon. It was wonderful having the two of you at our symposium in Westminster in September, and it's really good to invite you back, and we'll keep inviting you back till you get it right. No, thank you. We've covered quite a lot this afternoon. I think there are many different areas, ranging from is there Islamophobia within Jewish communities and anti-Semitism with the Muslim communities, and we know that there is. It's, as Danny said, it's not been documented yet, but I think there are still opportunities for us to explore that, to talk to people, to help them understand the errors of their understandings and beliefs that lead to some of those ideas. There is a lot of work as well going on in different interfaith organisations. Mentioned the Faith and Belief Forum. I know within Faith Network for Manchester and other Greater Manchester interfaith groups, as well as others around the country, there is work going on to do stuff with schools to try and increase understanding of different faiths, in particular Jewish, Christian and Muslim communities and faiths, but also among others as well. And I think that work is important. And inevitably, a lot of the stuff around Israel and Palestine impacts on people's understandings and feelings about Jewish and Muslim communities, and leads to flashpoints in Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, which is one of the reasons I think we need to continue to look at this and to work with this on an ongoing basis. We could probably carry on for a lot longer, but we're not going to. We know, Danny, that you have another commitment to get to, which is why we've moved this slightly earlier. But we felt it was important to have your perspective and Akeela's, and you're a good team together. We like having you with us. So thank you both very much. Thank you, Sadia, for leading this so well this afternoon, as always. Thank you to all of you for joining in. Our next session is on Thursday the 16th. We will be looking at Palestinian identity and Zionism. Not sure they're a complete parallel, but we will explore that. We look forward to seeing Sana again and hearing a lot more of you on that afternoon. If you haven't registered or want to register, want to know more, please email Sadia at admin@fodip.org.uk. I think you will know that email. And I will, well, you can unmute yourselves, I think, and we can talk around for a few minutes and say hi to each other. Thank you, Danny, Akeela, Sadia, and all of you. And stay well, take care, be safe, and God bless. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Talk to yourselves if you want.
Thanks so much.
Good seeing you all. Those I haven't said hi to, hi.